Hi everyone, welcome to another virtual author talk. My name is Maria Racina and I'm a librarian here at the Eleanor London Cote-Saint-Luc Library in Montreal. Today we have Kerri Maher joining us, author of The Kennedy Debutante in 2018 and The Girl in White Gloves, a novel of Grace Kelly in 2020, and her newest historical fiction novel, The Paris Bookseller, which we'll be discussing today. So before we begin, I'd just like to thank a few people, Tara O'Connor and Yasmin Hassan at Penguin Random House for helping to organize this event and for sending me a copy of the book, as our library copy is out and on a long waiting list. I'd also like to thank Danielle Bélanger in the programming department here at the library and Angela, who is in our background being tech support. So if you have trouble with your sound, please contact Angela in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and read a short synopsis of the book now, very short. When bookish young American Sylvia Beach opens Shakespeare & Company on a quiet street in Paris in 1919, she has no idea that she and her new bookstore will change the course of literature itself. So welcome, Kerri. Thank you so much for joining us. I just want to start by asking a little bit about the setting, because we were just, before you guys tuned in, we were talking about Montreal. So the setting of this book, Paris in the 1920s, what drew you to that setting?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. And I'm also grateful to Tara and Yasmin for setting this up. And you got the beautiful new paperback. It's got such a pretty cover. And people, we could talk, I don't know if you're going to ask me about the cover, but we're doing a little visual of it right now. Anyway, so why Paris in the 20s? Well, since I was a starry-eyed English major undergraduate in college, I've always been drawn to the writers and the time period of the 1920s, and specifically the writers, the expat writers who left America and went and settled in Paris or visited Paris. So like F. Scott Fitzgerald, for instance, never really lived in Paris like Ernest Hemingway did, but he came and went. And he went to the Riviera quite frequently, and he was part of that whole scene. So I've always been attracted to Paris in the 20s. Even when in my sort of years between undergrad and graduate school, I would read nonfiction histories of that time period. One that really stands out that I revisited for this book was called They Were All So Young by Amanda Vale. And as it was about Sarah and Gerald Murphy, who were a wealthy American couple in Paris in the 1920s. They weren't writers themselves, but they were friends with the whole crowd. So I guess I've just...
But they weren't in the book.
They weren't in the, I tried to figure out how to put them in the book. I couldn't fit everyone in the book. There were so many writers and artists and Americans, cool Americans and Brits and French, Frenchmen living in Paris at this time. I couldn't get everyone in there.
So you chose Sylvia as your lead character. You have this fantastic cast of characters. Like if it was a film, it'd be like a star-studded cast, and you chose Sylvia. Why?
So I'm going to harken back to those undergraduate days again, because I was obsessed with the 20s. And those great bargain book bins in front of college bookstores. So I was rummaging around in one of those one day, and I pull out a book called Shakespeare & Company by a woman named Sylvia Beach. I don't think I knew what that was when I picked up the book, but I flipped over and read the back of the book, and it just said Paris in the 20s and sold. So I think I probably bought it for 75 cents, brought it home, and I read it. And it was Sylvia's memoir of her time running Shakespeare & Company in the 20s and 30s in Paris, which also covered her adventure publishing Ulysses, which I'm sure we're going to talk more about. And so I just thought, wow, what an amazing story of this young American woman who is independent and, goes over there and opens this bookstore that effectively changes literature, 20th century literature. But again, I was 20 years old. I kind of filed it away under good to know, and went and on my own writing adventures. And I wrote, as you mentioned before, The Kennedy Debutante and The Girl in White Gloves. And I was looking around for a third subject, and I really quickly homed in on Sylvia. And because her story has kind of lived in me my entire adult life, it was sort of I was like, why haven't I thought of this before? Especially because, one of my mentor texts was The Paris Wife by Paula McLean, which is about Hemingway's early, first marriage and early years in Paris. It just hadn't occurred to me to write about Sylvia before. And I just feel so privileged and lucky that I got to do it when I did it.
Did you have that copy of the book in hand, or did you have to go and
No,
repurchase?
I had to buy a new copy of that book. I think I lent it to someone somewhere along the way. It never came back to me
Like a library situation.
exactly. I've had a few books like that in my lifetime. I thought, I don't even know where they are. Someone has it.
But sort of in line with that, so you know how every fiction novel has this part at the beginning that says something along the lines of, these are all fictional locations. Any resemblance to real people and circumstances are purely coincidental, but obviously not the case here. So, that's sort of the question. You have this like nonfiction and fiction, historical fiction challenge because you have all of these people that are so well known. So how did you go about sort of discovering them all? Did you have, I guess you must have done for each, or was it more based on their work or their biographies or archival material? What was your research?
Yeah. So there's, for me, there's sort of two questions in there. One is like, how do I balance, truth and fiction? And then how do I go about doing the research? Right. So the truth and fiction balance is just a tension I've learned to embrace. Right. I really like this Hilary Mantel quote. She said, historical fiction is not a photographic representation of a time and place and people. It's more like a painting with the brush strokes left in. And it's an interpretation, right? It's an interpretation of lives and times and places. So I really embrace that. If you were to write this same book, you would write it differently than I wrote it. So then the research piece. I am the first to admit that I could have researched this book till the day I died and never written a word, because we're talking, as you said, about the most famous writers of the 20th century who left behind their own lifetime bodies of work. And because of their fame and importance, many other people have written about them, so I couldn't read it all. And so I really had to make some hard choices about what I was going to read. And I used the fact that Sylvia was going to be my protagonist and my point of view character as kind of my guiding light. So I read as much as I possibly could about her and her life. And I read as many words of hers as I could. While balancing that with, I really needed to understand the legal arguments that were at stake around Ulysses. Okay. And so there were two books that I read about that. Obviously I needed to have Joyce's voice in my head. So I revisited some of his fiction. There were some letters that Joyce and Sylvia exchanged. So, that's what I did. And the good news was, because I've been reading about this time period and these writers for, again, my whole adult life, I was able to bring kind of all that reading, forward. I couldn't revisit all of it, but I could kind of dip in and out of reading I had already done to sort of remind myself of some things.
So they were like familiar. They already lived in your head and you
exactly.
sort of knew their voices. Yeah.
Yeah.
But so in line with that, then you had to sort of base not only that, but then all the relationships in the story. And I guess like I almost want to pick and choose in my questions here, but I think maybe to start with the first relationship, I was delighted and somehow didn't pick up on the fact that this was going to be a queer story until I started reading it. And I was so happy. And it surprised me that I didn't know this before. And then people I've spoken to about the book didn't either. So yeah, so tell me a little bit about Adrienne and how you got to know her.
Yeah, so this is an aspect of Sylvia's story that isn't very well known. I think it's because as queer lives sort of become more known and more talked about openly, I think it's becoming, people who have known about Sylvia, I think, have always known it. I didn't really realize it until I did the research for this book, because, back when I read her memoir the first time in college, it isn't clear from her memoir, because she wrote her memoir for an American audience in the 1950s. So she really minimized her relationship with Adrienne. She didn't talk very much about Adrienne. She really puts the focus on her relationships with her kind of friendship relationships with the famous writers, which, you know, obviously, you know, her publisher wanted her to do because that was what was going to sell all the copies of her books. But the major biography of her that came out in the 1980s by Noel Riley Fitch makes it clear that, you know, Sylvia and Adrienne were partners in business and romantically, and all recent writing has you know, made it clear that Sylvia was a lesbian, and that Adrienne was her partner, you know, in many ways a life partner. So, and it was delightful to sort of uncover this. And I think a really important aspect of Sylvia and Adrienne's relationship is the friendship that is based on their shared love of books. And it is really what carries their relationship through the many stages it goes through. No spoilers, that's all I'll say. And, you know, let me just say something about, let me give you background on Adrienne. We've sort of been talking around her. Adrienne, in 1915, in her early 20s, opens a bohemian bookstore in the Left Bank, that caters to, like, you know, the liberal French intellectuals of the war years. Okay. And by the time Sylvia stumbles into this bookstore in 1917, and it's in full swing, and Sylvia falls in love with the shop. And the shop is a hybrid bookstore and lending library, because books are very expensive and writers are broke. And Sylvia immediately plugs into this French literary world and starts lending out her own copies of English language literature, because these French intellectuals are hungry to read books in English, but they're not very well available in France. So Sylvia sees this opportunity to kind of provide this service to the French intellectual community. So when she opens Shakespeare and Company, she thinks of it as kind of the sister store to Adrienne's store, which it is. Sylvia opens Shakespeare and Company as an English language bookstore and lending library, having no idea that it will actually become the home of the lost generation American writers. And for 20 years, you know, those two stores, Adrienne's and Sylvia's, almost function as one store. It's really wonderful. I mean, if you love books, and, you know, Adrienne herself calls it Odeania, like a sort of mythical paradise of books.
Yeah, it's one of those places you wish that you could join in, right? And the ambiance really carries that through. And then the other relationship, I guess the major one in this story, is Joyce. You're writing James Joyce, you're writing about Ulysses, and you've got these Joycean scholars probably in the back of your head checking every little fact. What was it like creating him? Because he's quite the character. I mean, you know that by his work, but there's so much more here going on. Like, you really
Yeah.
feel his dynamic with Sylvia and all of the evolutions of that dynamic. I really felt it.
You know, Joyce, I guess a few things about that. Like, you know, so again, I did as much research as I could to kind of get the essence of Joyce right, but I try, you know, I'm very glad that this book wasn't my first try at historical fiction, because I might have given up, you know, exactly as you said. Like, how am I supposed to, like, put words in the mouth of James Joyce and Ernest Hemingway and all these famous writers? But fortunately, I'd had some practice with my first two novels. You know, I practiced with John F. Kennedy, and I practiced with Alfred Hitchcock and Grace Kelly. So when it came time for me to, like, you know, really go there with the literary giants of the 20th century, I had like cleared a few hurdles already, mental hurdles already. And again, I really try to embrace the fact that this is my version of James Joyce. It's not anybody else's version. And, you know, the other thing about all of these characters really is, you know, they're just people. In the end, you know, Joyce had his brilliant side, and also, which seems kind of superhuman to us, but he was also a man. He was a husband and a father. And he drank too much, and he loved word games. He loved music. He liked to sing. He was a person, and Sylvia became friends with the person. So, whenever I ran across, wonderful details in my research that really humanized the two of them and helped me understand the nature of their relationship, I looked for ways to work those into the book. So for instance, there's a game that they play in the novel, which they really did play in real life, which was the sort of spot Leopold Bloom is what I call it. They would stand on the steps of the store or go to a cafe and smoke themselves through a pack of cigarettes, and they would watch the world go by, and they would say, "Oh, that's Leopold Bloom, that's Molly Bloom, that's Stephen Dedalus," and so they really did do this. And so that gave me such a sense of fun and play in their relationship. And so I gave them one or two other games also that I don't, they didn't necessarily play. They played a lot. They were both multilingual. And so they played a lot of multilingual word games, which I could not try and mimic because I am not myself multilingual. So I had to kind of skip over that.
So actually, that's a good sort of segue question. I guess we'll go back to Joyce and Ulysses, but this multilingual aspect, because you're writing a book set in Paris about an American shop, and then you've got these people who are not fluent in French, and you've got characters that are not fluent in English, and you've got all this translation stuff going on. What was that like?
Well, I mean, my main and really only language is English. The only other language I've ever taken in my life is French. So I do have some rudimentary knowledge of the French language, which I really, stretched to its capacity in places. And, if I needed a particular phrase in French, I would go to someone I knew who spoke, good French, and I would ask. But, I know that there's some commentary throughout the book about the writers and characters who do kind of immerse themselves in the life of Paris and speak French, and those who don't. And that was an important, that was actually something that Sylvia herself commented on. She absolutely became French as she possibly as a person could. She was, completely bilingual. But and one of the things she really likes about Ernest Hemingway is he is too. He also completely immerses himself in Paris intellectual life and cultural life. But Gertrude Stein does not.
Yeah, she's quite a figure too. I mean, she was
right. Yeah. So, I did what I could with the skills and knowledge that I had on the front of language.
Yeah, I liked that. The big word, that dichotomy of Joyce versus Stein, and it was this battle.
Yes. Joyce also being, a lover of language, he also really immersed himself in the French living. He and his family lived there for years and years without really interruption, after having lived in Italy for years without interruption.
So sort of back to Joyce and Ulysses. So you had to focus on that. So you said that was something you discovered in the research, and that the publication and the process of that and all the heartache that came with that. I'm assuming you'd read Ulysses before, and this was.
Yeah, I knew that Ulysses was a banned book, right? But I didn't really understand what the sort of legal and artistic stakes were when it became a banned book. And also, I go into this in much more detail in the book, and so it's not a big spoiler. What I really didn't understand until I researched this book, and I think very few people really do, is that in 1921, when Ulysses becomes a banned book, it's never the book or Joyce that stands trial. It's two women. Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap, who are the editors of an avant-garde literary journal in New York called The Little Review. And The Little Review has been serializing Ulysses since 1918. And they have increasingly come under the scrutiny of the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, the Vice Squad. I know but the Vice Squad, which
The
is led
Vice
by this
Squad.
man named John Sumner, who just has a bee in his bonnet about Margaret and Jane, because they are a lesbian couple, and they had both in earlier years supported this well-known anarchist named Emma Goldman. And here they are serializing this potentially obscene novel called Ulysses. And so the Vice Squad uses the post office as its instrument of censorship. So when the Little Review goes out in the mail to its subscribers, it was getting seized and sometimes burned. And finally they are arrested for publishing. I should double check this. I think it was the Nausicaa episode of Ulysses. So they are brought to trial for publishing obscenity, and they are found guilty. And by extension, the book then becomes a banned book. But it's really these two brave women who stand trial for publishing it.
And as you were writing it, I mean, like 100 years later, and I'm sure you were getting all this stuff in the media about books being banned
Yes.
now.
Yes.
Did it, I mean, did that, do you think that impacted how much of it, or it's just because it was just the same story and it's just happening again? Do you think that it impacted sort of the way that it was written?
No, listen, books are, we go through these cycles of censorship. I feel like at least in the United States, we go through these cycles of censorship. And yes, we were in a cycle of it when, as I was sort of, I think all of that was really happening more as the book was in edits. So there wasn't very, I don't think it really would have changed the way I wrote the book. And, I about censorship in general, I think I generally take a historian's view. We can't really know how people will view the censorship of 2022 for some years yet.
Yeah, that's true. Like
You know,
retroactive.
Right, exactly. But what we know about Ulysses is that the people who believed in Ulysses as art, Sylvia and her crowd, they were right. It was art. It wasn't smut, and the people who saw that, they were the forward thinkers of their time.
And I don't want to give spoilers, but do you think
I know it's hard.
Sylvia's story, I read it, there's so much emotion and energy and so much that she puts into this book and this work and getting it out there and saving it. Like, that's historical, so it's not spoilers.
Yeah.
Do you think it's an inspirational story or a cautionary tale of like how much you give? Do you know what I mean?
I think, can't it be both? I think it can be both, right? Like, I think, she says in her own memoir that she does not recommend that anyone go into the venture of publishing as she did, which was knowing nothing. And, but she has such a sense of humor about it, I think that even knowing what she knew at the end, she still would have done it. I think it was, let's just leave it at, the publishing of Ulysses was for her an enormous roller coaster ride. But what a thrill, right? Like, all the ups and downs. I think she, as frustrated as she got at particular moments, over the course of a 10-year period, I think she would absolutely have done it again. Because I think she, at the end, she absolutely knew that what she had done had changed literature. By the early 30s, we have William Faulkner writing in a Joycean mode. We have, Virginia Woolf, who had refused to publish Ulysses in 1921 in Richmond, England, writing in a Joycean mode. Like, she saw how important, she saw that she was really right, and that she was right to have published it when she did.
Yeah, and Wolf probably more provocative than even Joyce was, debatably.
Right. It paved the way, right? It
Yeah.
paved.
So, like, easier question. There's a lot about food. How did you go about researching all the delicious food?
I just love food, and I love French food, and one of I do cook myself, so I know my way around a kitchen. So that was, and Adrienne, I think a lot of the food is linked to Adrienne. Adrienne was a well-known gourmet cook, and lover of all things gourmet. So that was an easy thing to give her, as a character trait. It was true. It was something that I really identified with in her. So when she's like making the macarons for the and cooking all night in her kitchen, for something, and I think all that felt really real to me and fun to write. And I think because I really enjoy food, in many ways, it's a way for me to add kind of texture and local color to a novel. And who doesn't love French pastry and
And reading about French pastries.
all of that? I know.
So to go back to the cover, right? So
Yes.
tell me about it. Where did it come from? And
So
is it Sylvia over here?
Yeah, so people who listen to I guess people who are seeing this can see that I'm gesturing to a painting that's behind me, which is the cover of the book. So, so many times a book cover is created from in a publisher's art department from a bunch of stock images that are artfully put together, to create a harmonious picture for the cover. I don't really know why, but in the case of the Paris bookseller, my publisher decided to commission a painter named Kerri Maher, who I guess used to do this quite a lot for book covers, like years ago, but has now really transitioned to just being a fine art painter, and he lives in Southern California, to paint the store and Sylvia and Joyce, and you see the little dog Teddy also. He was my request. He's actually a character in the book. He's in a few really important scenes. So I thought that Teddy should make an appearance on the cover. And so really I will be eternally grateful to my publisher for making this the cover. And I managed to get my hands on it and buy it. So that is why I always.
That's the original behind you?
Yes, this is the painting.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So what I don't know, and I should just ask because I get this question asked to me a lot. So Terry obviously painted this painting in his studio in Los Angeles, and then he must have taken a photo of it, which then went to the Berkeley Art Department, and from the digital image of the painting, they created the cover. Mm-hmm. So they layered the title and my name. Yeah. All that stuff on top of it.
But is this like the original? Is this based on what the original Shakespeare & Company would have looked like? Is it the current store?
So there was a whole bunch of back and forth between me and the publishing team and the artist. He did a bunch of sketches. He started with like pencil sketches, and everyone was looking at the photographs that exist of the store. Okay, the store also, just as a side note, had 2 locations, and I don't know, and none of the locations of Sylvia's store are the current Shakespeare & Company. I hope we get, hopefully we'll talk about that for a few minutes, at least at the end. But so she had one location for 2 years when she first opened on a street called the Rue du Pitren. But in 1921, she moved around the corner to the Rue de l'Odéon, which was across the street from Adrienne's store. So that's really when Adrienne called their 2 stores Odeonia. So it's based on the Rue de l'Odéon. And please excuse my French. I know it's not great. So, so this image is based on the photographs of the Rue de l'Odéon store. Okay. And so that's what it is. So it's based on photographs. One of the questions we really had though was, what color was it? Because all the photographs are black and white. And I really looked back at all my books about that might have said what color the store was, and we couldn't figure it out. Now, the current Shakespeare & Company in Paris, which again is not Sylvia's store, but it's related, is green. And many times when Sylvia's store is represented on a book cover, like the current edition of her memoir represents the store as green. And I don't know whether that's because they know something I don't know, that the original store was green, or if they're just somehow apocryphally it's gone down as green and everyone now paints it as green. I don't know. But we just decided that green was the safe color.
Yeah,
And
and you've got the green chair in the book that keeps coming up.
that's true. That I made up. That was a work of fiction.
I
The green.
really wished I had a green chair for this interview. I kept thinking about it.
Yeah. So, but I also like the fact that we do represent it as green, and that it's also kind of a hearkening to the current store, which is green and has like yellow in the title of the store.
So, did you go to Paris and then go to the existing shop and then sort of have a walk around? Is that?
I did. I got to go to Paris in the summer of 2019 before the world shut down. And
Close
yes,
call.
yes. And I got to soak it up. It was really amazing. I actually got to stay in a building that James Joyce himself lived in in the summer of 1921. He and his family lived there. It was on loan to him from the French poet Valery Larbaud, who's a character in the book and a really good friend of Sylvia's. So there's two plaques on the outside of this building one that says, Valery Larbaud lived here for many years, and James Joyce lived here while he was writing Ulysses. No one actually knows which apartment it was, but it's on a lovely little street. And if you sort of walk up the driveway, which it empties into this beautiful cobblestone courtyard. And so I got to imagine Joyce like sitting on a bench under a tree working on Ulysses on a hot, summer afternoon. And just up the block, there's another one of those plaques that says, "This is where Ernest Hemingway first lived when he moved to Paris." So I was really in that neighborhood. Now, so those residences, I did I walked these routes many times. Those residences were about a 15-ish minute walk to Sylvia's store. And if you walk between Sylvia's store on the Rue de l'Odéon and the current store now, that's about, if you make no stops at all, it's barely a 10-minute walk. And I actually, on a website called Trip Fiction, I did a little walking tour between the stores. I show you a few places to stop and take nice pictures and buy a souvenir also. So you can easily walk these distances. They're not long. The current store, shall I talk a little bit about the current?
Yeah, please.
We sort of talked around it so much. So the current store is in this wonderful location in Paris. It's right on the Seine. If you stand in front of the store, you are looking at Notre Dame Cathedral. I mean, it's really like an amazing location. And it has been in that location since 1951. Sylvia had to close her store in 1941 during the Nazi occupation of Paris, and she never reopened. The current Shakespeare & Company actually opened under a different name, Le Mistral, and it was opened by a different American named George Whitman. And Sylvia was a regular in George's store in Le Mistral. And George renamed the store Shakespeare & Company in 1964 on the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's birth, but also Sylvia at that point had passed away. And so that store is very much an homage to Sylvia's store. If you go in there, they have all kinds of history and ephemera about Sylvia's original store. They make the connection as clear as they possibly can. And this is really lovely. George had a daughter who he named Sylvia. And so Sylvia Whitman runs Shakespeare and Company today. And I've gotten to meet her and her two lovely children. And I got to I signed books there last spring in May. It was really like kind of wildest dreams come true kind of stuff.
It's like you joined the community you wrote about.
It was a little bit like that. um,
Wow.
yeah, it's really, I mean, so this Shakespeare and Company has had a much, much longer history than Sylvia's. And there's a great novel about that store too. That store has played host to all, other generations of wandering American writers. The beat poets all went there. All the writers and the rock stars of the 60s went there. um, you know it's an important place in its own right.
So you sort of alluded to this in the conversation, but there's so much. So the book ends at a given time, but there's all this other stuff that you're talking about now. How did you know when to stop Sylvia's story? Because you didn't stop with the closure, which you've now mentioned.
Right. Yeah. So it's a good question. And this book had many drafts, and there were some years that I wrote that wound up on the cutting room floor. I wound up deciding that the most satisfying arc is the arc that's in the novel, which is basically from when she meets Adrienne in 1917 to when in the 1930s, basically the book ends in 1937, so 20 years later, when the store is kind of saved by the friends of Shakespeare and Company. And her journey with Ulysses at that point is also essentially complete. So there was just, it just made sense. I did actually try. I did actually write beyond that section initially, but those pages always kind of felt kind of tacked on. And how do you do also, like, I felt like I was like doing all of World War II in like 80 pages, and like that, it wasn't right for the book, the book I was trying to write. So,
Yeah, I guess to be kind of a downer from there. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I, it's really hard sometimes to figure out, how much of a life to represent, and how much of an event to represent. Like, where is the frame going to be? I'm like looking at the frame of the painting, right? Like, where is the frame going to be? And sometimes you have to like do some cropping. So I had to do some cropping.
Yeah, I guess it's the thing with historical fiction is different from just fiction, because with regular fiction, you ask authors, oh, well, what happens to the characters afterwards? Well, people can just go read the biographies and they can find out what happens to the characters afterwards.
Yeah. With this one, so as a result of the cropping I had to do, the author's note for this book became very long because I do sort of tell the rest of the story in a much abridged way in the author's note.
Yeah, but in case people didn't, I don't know, do all the copies have the author's note in it? Because mine also has discussion questions, which I chose not to use here, so that if people have it in their book clubs, they can use the discussion
Yeah,
questions.
I think all the editions should have the author's note.
So my final question that I had on my list is, so the book really does read like it's a love letter to literature, to writers, to book distributors. So what advice do you have for aspiring writers?
Oh, well, I'm going to answer that question, but I also want to say about the love letter. I did write this, most of it during the pandemic, when libraries and bookstores really came to the rescue of books and writers and readers, right? Like, you all put your heads together, and and publicists and all the people connected with getting books into readers' hands, right? You guys all got together to figure out how to make sure people could keep reading and keep connecting with writers. And that was so inspirational to me. I was like, oh, Sylvia would have been on the front lines of this. And in
You
fact,
would have
Sylvia
had like a
was.
delivery service.
Yes, yes. And in fact, Sylvia Whitman in Shakespeare and Company Paris was. So anyway, so there's that. And I always, that's such an important thing, I think, to recognize. And because it did inspire me. It wasn't, I couldn't write about it directly, obviously, but it really helped me embrace this idea that like the bookseller is an important figure in our communities, in our lives, right? Okay. So advice to aspiring writers: find your community. um, you know, I have found this to be true in my own life, and I think it's clearly true of the writers in this book. You need to find the people who are going to help sustain you over a period of decades. And it's not always going to be the same one person. It's going to be maybe different people over time. Um, but the writing life is very long, and it's full of a lot of ups and downs. And you need people to exchange work with. You need people who are going to hand you the tissues and show you back to your desk. Um, pick you up and dust you off, all the metaphors, right? And it's just so important. And it's also fun, right? It's fun to have friends that you're going to talk to about your work, about projects you're excited about, things that and it's essential to have friends who really understand the kind of specific disappointments that come with being a writer. So I would say that. And so how do you find your people? You take classes, you join writers groups, you look for them in your community centers. You can take, there are places like Grub Street in Boston and the Gotham Writers Workshop out of New York who offer lots of classes online these days. And so you can take them from Nebraska or Montreal, wherever you are. And so that's how you find your community, and you just build it over time.
That's solid advice. I mean, I definitely, you wish that you've had people in your life that are such advocates for the things that you write. Like you with Ulysses, for sure. Like Sylvia goes out on a limb, and that pays off in the end. So
Yeah.
it's so
Hang out
I
at your
think
local bookstore. Hang out at your local library. Those are where the book lovers are.
so. I'm gonna drop some information here for people who are looking to buy the book. Support your local bookstores. We work a
Yes.
lot with Paragraph Books, so we recommend that you go and buy your copy there. As you're waiting also for the library copy. Often what I do is I borrow from the library, and then if I like something, then I buy it. That is my way.
Lots of people do that.
So with that, I'm going to open up to questions from our attendees. We have some people that are over the phone, so they won't be able to speak, but anybody else who's got a question, now is the time. Drop it in the chat while we're waiting. Just sort of final question on the cover. So are there physical descriptions of Sylvia and Adrienne? Because like in letters and exchanges, you wouldn't have that stuff.
So there are pictures of them.
Okay.
There are plenty of pictures of them, and yes, people wrote about the both of them and described them both. Sylvia is almost always described like in bird-like terms. I think Hemingway even says she's bird-like, but he's not the only one. I think she's very petite and slim, and I think she was she was kind of tightly coiled, and she really was a chain smoker. And Adrienne was sort of, I think, softer, and I don't know how much taller she was, but she was a larger figure, and she wore kind of old-fashioned clothes. She always seems to be wearing a cape or a long skirt. Even in the 20s, right, when the hemlines were lifted, they both had shorter hair. Yeah, and Adrienne had this, even you can tell this even in the black and white photos, that she had this like very fair skin but very dark hair. So I try to describe her that way, and as part of Sylvia's attraction to her.
And I guess that was sort of the styles were codified, presumably, because you wouldn't, like, people knew that people were out, but they would maybe guess based on their style or their hair and
Yeah, I mean, I think that the real codified dressing happened in the after hours bars and cabarets and stuff like that. I think there was some of it that happened in the just daily life. The monocle, like a woman wearing a monocle was a dead giveaway that she was a lesbian. But it's not like all the lesbians were walking around wearing monocles either.
that'd be a little too obvious.
No, but like there's there's a little line in the book where I have Sylvia reflect that she has a monocle in her desk drawer. But she's not about to like put it on. Everyone's, we get into like personality differences too. I mean, I think she was really an immensely I hesitate to use the word private because she did write this memoir and everything, but I think she was content to be in the background. Like she wasn't spotlight seeking. That's a different kind of personality, really. Grace Kelly was a spotlight seeker, and there were real reasons for that in her life, right? And so that was an aspect of her personality I got to explore in writing that book. And so Sylvia was a really different person.
Yeah, I found that aspect of Sylvia very relatable, as a librarian who works in a quiet area, this kind of more, she's not demure at all though, but she's really quietly strong. But it also, what's the part where she's like intimidated almost by all her friends, that's a feeling that you get when you interview authors. You're like, will I sound scholarly enough to speak to this person?
Yes, you do.
Choice, right? And I when I was preparing for this, I was thinking like, oh, I relate to Sylvia in this experience.
Yeah, right. But and it's also interesting, like she really wanted the store to be famous. It's so interesting. Like she didn't really care about fame or anything for herself, but she did want the store to do well and to be well known.
So we have a question from Debbie. She's asking, what is your next project? If you're allowed to tell us.
I am allowed to tell you. It's coming out in September, in fact. September 19th. It's called All You Have to Do Is Call. And it is set in Chicago in the very early 1970s. And it's about an underground women's health clinic before Roe. It is loosely based on the women of the Jane Collective, but it's in many ways really a departure for me. Paris Bookseller, Kennedy Debutante, and Girl in White Gloves were all sort of niches of historical fiction that's known as biographical fiction. So it really takes the life of one woman who once lived and tells that story. All You Have to Do Is Call. All the characters are entirely fictional, and it's like loosely based on real events. But instead of one main character, point of view character, there are three. So there are three main characters and the narrative gets braided together.
So is that the first time that you're doing multi-POV work?
The first time in a long time. Yeah. My very, very first unpublished novel was 3 points of view.
The secret novel that no one will ever see.
No, it's not a secret. Actually, I talk about this very openly. I have 5 unpublished novels. This is much more common than people want to talk about. I guess that's another sort of like bonus piece of advice for aspiring writers is just keep writing. I think about Dory in Finding Nemo singing, just keep swimming, just keep swimming. It's like, just keep writing, just keep writing. You just got to do it. You just got to keep doing it. Like there's a lot of five unpublished novels. But it happened. And it was all worthwhile when it happened.
That's crazy. I guess, yeah, people don't really think about that. They just assume that you write it up, you get your community, and then they tell you what's wrong with it, and then you fix it, and then your editor helps, and then you're off to the races.
No, I mean, I've been writing a long time. I mean, I wrote my first unfinished novel in 5th grade. So I've been on this path for a long time. I'm not counting that in the 5. But yeah, and but every one of those 5 taught me really, really important things about writing novels, right? And it got me to the point where I was able to write The Kennedy Debutante. And additionally, some of those books got me other things. My first novel got me into graduate school for creative writing. My third novel got me my first literary agent. She tried to sell the book unsuccessfully, but we were together for a long time, and she did sell my memoir. This is not a writing manual. So, like, there are rewards along the way. You just have
So
to.
you have a non-writing manual that we can purchase too as well. Tell us about that. I didn't mention
Oh
that.
yeah, so under a different name, Kerri Majors, which is my married name, is this is not a writing manual, and it's like an advicey memoir about what it was like to become a writer. And I think I still feel like this is important. I wrote it before I got a book deal, and so it's really about why the writing life is worth living, even before you've inked the big deal. you know so it's 10 years old at this point. You can still buy it. It was
At least
published by
it wasn't too difficult a transition with family names, right? Sounds similar enough that people will remember it. So under Kerri Majors,
Yeah,
everybody.
I mean, you can find it. It's on my website, and it's not hard to find.
Amazing. So we look forward to your September project. I think that's all the time we have.
Okay.
So I just want to remind everybody that on Wednesday, January 25th at 2 p.m., my colleague Danielle Bélanger will be interviewing author Armando Lucas Correa, author of The Night Travelers. So thank you so much, Kerri, for joining us tonight. And thank you for all of you who attended and listened. And thank you, Debbie, for asking a question, being the brave one tonight. We have a lot of people that call in, so they actually can't ask questions, but we also have a lot of people in the chat that I'm sure will come back. If they want to get in touch with you and ask you questions, where can they find you on the internet?
Oh, so I am most active on Instagram. I am at Kerri Maher Writer on Instagram, and I'm there all the time.
Perfect.
I
So
also have a
please
website, which is kerrimaher.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And so the Paris bookseller, everybody. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you for joining us. Bye.